Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Method Ministries. This is Lucas Curcio, and I'm here with Dr. Marcus Ross. Dr. Marcus Ross, thank you and welcome to Method Ministries.
Hey, thank you very much. Delight to be on.
Yeah. Well, pleasure's all mine. I saw a couple of your debates you did, but I was just telling you like a couple minutes ago. I go to Liberty Online as well, so that's where I first found out about you through one of our video studies on this topic too. It was on
Hmm.
evolution and everything. So I'm excited to have you here and be a blessing to us.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I worked at Liberty for 16 years,
Wow.
from 2001 to from 2005 to 2021, and stepped down at the end of that. Just my wife and I had started a science supply company, and it had started growing and doing rather well. And pretty soon, I decided that I wanted one job rather than two, and so it was. It was tough to kind of leave the classroom. I really enjoyed teaching. I
Mm.
like communicating information and talking with students about things, wrestling about topics together. So it's been a little weird not being a teacher after having been in school for, oh, my goodness. When I think about it, I've been in school for 40 years between
Wow.
from kindergarten through all the schooling to teaching and whatnot. It was 40 years in the classroom.
Ooh,
And now I'm in an office in a warehouse, trying to make science supplies for homeschoolers and
nice.
public school kids, and all sorts of stuff like that. So a big switch, but a welcome one. I really enjoyed it.
Man, you said 40 years. Like, I'm thinking, well, you don't look old to me. Like, I don't want to ask your age, but you look great. So,
Well, thank you. That's because the camera doesn't notice the giant bald spot that's moving. So
yeah, maybe there's some creation, secrets to, being healthy you can share with us.
yeah. Mostly, my approach is diet soda and chocolates. I mean, no, I got no secrets. I got
Awesome.
nothing.
That's in the Bible too. We'll talk about that. Is
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else, you want to introduce yourself as, because you said, you're a professor and, anything
Yeah.
else you want to tell us about
Well,
yourself?
sure. For your audience's background on me, I am an evangelical Christian. I grew up in the church with a spiritually mixed household. My
Mm.
father is not a believer; he's still agnostic. My mom became a believer shortly after I was born, and my sister was born. My sister, by the way, is also a professor at Liberty University. Her name's
Oh,
Dr. Jillian Ross. So we have Ross the younger and
taking
Ross the
over.
elder. Feeling good and biblical about these things. She teaches Old Testament,
Hmm.
ancient Near East, and biblical languages. She does
Wow.
Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. She's learned half a dozen other languages that nobody's spoken in 6,000, 3,000 years or something like that. So it's really just a fantastic combination for the two of us to be around together, especially when we delve into creation topics, to have somebody who's that knowledgeable about Genesis, the ancient Near East context of Genesis, the biblical languages, and really helps put a good check on me when I want to start talking about stuff. As a science guy, my own background is in paleontology. I'm a
Mm.
fossils and rocks guy, and I always loved dinosaurs ever since I was a little kid. I learned about dinosaurs when I was 4.
Wow.
When I was 7, I discovered there was such a thing as a paleontologist, and it was like, well, that's what I want to do. And the Lord saw fit to take a little kid who was enthusiastic about the things that he has made and the things that he has hidden in the ground, and let me go on through. And I went to lots of different schools. I spent all my life in the public school, secular school arena until I started teaching at Liberty. So I never grew up in a Christian school. I went to public school. I went to Penn State for my undergraduate. So you're up in New Jersey. You got a lot of
Yep.
people out there who go to Penn State. Big Nittany Lion fan. Um, from there, I went to the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, which is a small engineering and mining school out in the Black Hills. And then I boomeranged back to my home state of Rhode Island to work on my PhD in vertebrate paleontology. I studied a group of animals called mosasaurs, which are big swimming marine reptiles. If you remember Jurassic World,
Yeah.
there's the huge thing in the water that really saves the day. Woohoo! My guys finally got a day in the limelight, which was great
Nice.
for the mosasaurs, and those were the critters that I studied. And I came to Liberty a little bit before I'd finished off my PhD. I still had to defend my dissertation and finish writing that up, and did that, and had been at Liberty, ever since 2005 to 2021. I worked with the Center for Creation Studies at Liberty, and became the director there for my last 4 years, from 2017 to 2021. I served as director of the Center for Creation Studies. Also taught classes in paleontology, earth science, environmental studies, anything they asked for.
Man, you're the man for the job, I feel like, and, you've done a couple how many debates have you done? It seems like there's a decent amount out there.
A few. It's more like there's been a few recently, and so
Yeah.
I'm starting to pile them in, and it looks good for me. But my first, I've done a few debates. The first one that I did was actually way back in 2007 or so. I had a dialogue conversation with a paleontologist, Dr. Peter Dodson. He's a very famous dinosaur paleontologist, retired now from the University of Pennsylvania, and the two of us gave presentations on a conventional secular approach to evolution and the fossil record. I gave one from a more intelligent design standpoint. But the two of us had a great time. He is a very dedicated Catholic, would go to mass at least once a day, sometimes twice on his way to and from school. He walked past his local parish. And that was my first debate, if you will. And then it would be a little while later. I debated Dr. Hugh Ross, no
Yeah.
relation,
Yeah.
on the age of the Earth and biblical arguments for an old or young Earth in 2016, and again last year we did a video debate. The first one was recorded but never made it to the internet for some reason.
Hmm.
And I've also had a couple of debates with Dr. Josh Swamidas from Peaceful Science. He's a biologist, a computational biologist. He proposed that Adam and Eve could be just our genealogical ancestors, just like one of our great grandparents back there. But our species evolved out of standard Darwinian processes. So we had lots of other grandparents out there. So he and I had a debate in 2021, I think it was. Yeah, 2021 out at Trinity. And we met up with another debate and discussion with Dr. Fuzz Rana from Reasons to Believe early in 2022. And currently I'm in a book debate that'll be forthcoming next year on the topic of a historical Adam. So maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love those, like, those 4 views or 5 views books. Man, like, I have so much of those books, so I'm looking forward to that.
They are really such a great resource
They are.
for, the theologian, for the pastor who's just looking to say, what are the options that are out there? What are the people talking about right now?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
just concise, helpful, and hopefully everybody does a good job on their own side. Every once in a while you're like, you hate it when it's your own and you're like, this really, somebody could have done better. So I hope I'm not that guy. Hope I'm bringing a good argument to the table at this one.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. And, yeah, that being said, can you give us answer the question for our audience, what is the biblical creation model?
Sure. So when somebody often talks about a biblical creation model, there'll be some folks who are like, "Hey, wait a minute, you have a biblical creation model, not the one, Dr. Ross, right?" Remember that. So a lot of times when people say that, they're thinking about a young Earth creation perspective. So with the recognition that my old Earth colleagues would differ on this, but I would say that for a young Earth creation perspective on the world, which is a view that dominated the church from its very inception all the way to the present. And now we find ourselves with a lot more discussion. But a typical perspective is that God created the world in 6 days as we experience them. There were some in the early church who thought that these days were an analogy or an allegory for something else. But nonetheless, even though there was some difference about how to interpret Genesis 1, everybody agreed from this point onward. So even if you took Genesis 1 as usually an allegory of instantaneous creation, the timeline didn't change. The earth was only a few thousands of years old, and world history basically started with Adam and human history as well. So Adam was created by God directly from the dust, and Eve created from his rib. That they had a literal temptation and failure in the garden to obey God, and they ate of the fruit and brought sin into the world. That the sin that they brought into the world had cosmic consequences. So not just consequences only for them that they would become mortal, that was part of it, that they would die, but also that the effects of sin would reverberate throughout the rest of creation. And we have, for example, in Romans 8, talks about all of creation as groaning and travailing like a woman who's in the pangs of childbirth. And it was subjected to this, Romans says, not willingly, but by him who subjected it, and that would be God. So this is a passage that's alluding back to Genesis 3. Things like pangs of childbirth are a real echo there because, of course, one of the punishments for Eve was that she would have increased pain in childbirth.
Yeah.
So the effects of the fall bring sin and death. Particularly, most young Earth creationists think animal death is initiated at this point, death to the nephesh creatures, the creatures that have breath of life in them. That history continues on, and the wickedness of mankind builds to such a point that God decides to destroy the world, to kind of control, delete everything with a global flood. But through the righteousness of one man, Noah, humanity is spared, and representatives of the living creatures, the land, animals, birds, etc., are taken on board the ark. The world is completely and utterly destroyed and reshaped and reformed. That this event was universal. It covered the entire world. And then we have a period of recolonization and rebuilding of the world after the flood, leading ultimately to another rebellion at the Tower of Babel, where people are trying to resist God's command to go out, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Instead, they, as one of my pastors had said, and I'd never heard it like this before, and I'd been studying Genesis for a long time, just hadn't noticed that. He said, everybody gets together and they decide that God's not going to scatter them. And the way they decide that that's not going to happen is they build a giant waterproof building out of brick and pitch. And you go, huh, yeah, people are really dumb. They just don't remember that God promised I'm never going to do this again. And they're like, you bet you're not going to do it because we've got a building that can withstand water. And like, no, guys. So the overall perspective here is that we have a world that has a very finite age that's measured in thousands of years, a event at the fall that has repercussions that are far bigger than just humanity, and a worldwide global flood that alters the entire history of mankind. And thinking from a scientific standpoint is probably going to leave a lot of different sorts of geological evidences around of its existence, of its occurrence in the past.
Wow. And I like how you mentioned, you talked about Genesis, but you also quoted like Romans. And I think that fits in well with, we talk about the word biblical, right? Biblical is a collection of books. So it's not just taught in one chapter, it's taught consistently through the Bible, which you touched on the New Testament and you touched on the Old Testament. So I think that was awesome.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It is one of those things that we have to be very careful about. And you'll see this sometimes in commentaries or discussions where people are talking about Genesis, and they stick really, really close to Genesis 1 or 3 or something like that, which is important. We need to grapple close with the text. But as you mentioned, right, we've got a collection of books that we call the Bible here. And if the Holy Spirit is, in fact, the moving force and inspiration and collating and collecting these works to communicate God to us, then we expect there to be a consistency across those books. And when it comes to the events in Genesis, 1 through 11, we do find that elsewhere in the Old Testament, elsewhere in the New Testament, that this, I think, and it's my bias here, but I do think that a young Earth creation perspective makes the most sense, not only out of Genesis 1 through 11, but the canon of Scripture, looking back into it and saying, yeah, there's a lot, there's very few things that we have to look back at and go, well, maybe we need to understand it a little bit differently or something like that. There's always those points where you kind of have some questions, but I think young Earth creationism requires the least tinkering with what seems to be the unified position of the Bible.
Yeah, and you said it too, like use the word literal. A lot of people, they get so confused, I feel like, by that term literal, and they think that, the example I always give is that when Jesus says he's a door, that literal means that he's an actual door. And not, and there's this, misunderstanding with what we mean by, by literal. So, can you explain, like, what do we mean by literal when we say the Bible should be interpreted literally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You're right. People get a little tripped up on this, and it's because other people, I think, abuse this term a bit too much. If we go back to the Reformation, we find that one of the great principles of the Reformation, along with the others, right, was what was called sensus literalis, that you approach the text in a literal way, recognizing the genre, the style, the meaning of the text. So the way to literally approach an allegory is to read it as allegory, right? Not as a factual representation. So when Jesus says, as you mentioned, right, I am the door, he is speaking in an analogy. And so our literal interpretation is Jesus is analogous to a door. We come into, through, we meet with God, but we can only do that through Jesus in some way, not because he's on hinges, right? That type of thing.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at these passages in Genesis, for example, one of the first questions we have to figure out is, what sort of writing is this? Because if this is an analogy, then we need to read it literally as an analogy. I can't read Aesop's fables as if they're historical. They're not, right? That's doing damage to the text. That's reading things improperly. And when we take a look at how Genesis 1 through 11 compares to, say, the rest of the book of Genesis, we find that the style of writing is pretty much the same. So if you take, what is talked about with Noah and compare that to what's talked about and the way that it's talked about with Abram, the writing style is the same. You see the same sort of overall structure. It's a narrative, which means it's giving us a series of events through time. Those narratives could be historical. Narratives can also be stories that are fictitious, right? Those sorts of things. But when we find that the people that are in Genesis 1 through 11, like Adam, like Noah, etc., are directly linked to historical people like Abram and Isaac and Jacob through genealogies, etc., and they're written about in the same way, you come to the very reasonable, I think really the only conclusion is that the Bible intends you to understand these as historical individuals and the things that they experienced as historical events.
And yeah, and that being said too, because usually or most of the time when we talk about young Earth creationism, we're saying 6-day creationism. So can you like walk us through Genesis 1, because as we mentioned, it is a biblical theology that you can see that creation throughout the whole Bible. When we talk about, well, how many days was it created in? We do have to go to Genesis 1. And being that we kind of talked about literal hermeneutics, can you walk us through Genesis 1 and like tell us like how is this taught that God created literally in 6 days?
That's a good question. And as I mentioned earlier, it's one that has been debated amongst the church ever since the church's beginnings. And before that, amongst Jewish writings, we see basically two camps in the ancient world, or at least, kind of Second Temple Judaism, etc. And that is, we find some that say that these are 6 actual days. And those tend to be the folks that are living in and around Israel. It's down in Egypt, in Alexandria, where there's a large collection of Jews living at the time, that you see the first inklings of the days of creation being understood in some sort of analogical way, in some sort of analogy, or whatnot, maybe a vision or what have you. So it's almost unsurprising then that as the Christian church emerges, you end up seeing these two camps as well. And again, they're separated somewhat geographically, at least early on. If you think about the church at Alexandria, which was a major Christian center early on, it's where Augustine came out of. They held to this analogical approach. But you go to the north and you look at, say, Antioch, which was also a powerhouse of Christian ministry and kind of early seminaries and building out the word. They held to 6-day creationism as far as regular days. And I think it's important to recognize that, particularly when it comes to Antioch, Paul spent a year in Antioch ministering to that church, teaching that church. That was part of his early ministry going up there. And so I think it's very telling that the Antiochian view of Genesis is one that is of literal 6 days. I think that flows directly out of Paul's teaching. Not that Paul teaches much about the 6 days of creation in the Bible. He doesn't. But we do see him make very strong arguments about the historicity of Adam, the importance of Adam as a singular individual. And those sorts of things, I think, mesh really well with the 6-day creation aspect. So let's think then about Genesis 1. And why is it that I think a 6-day approach that looks at the days as normal days works for us here? First off, there aren't many internal hints to Genesis that we're talking about some sort of analogy here. Instead, the style of writing is narrative, right? It's moving us through time and space. It's not like Hebrew couplets and poetry or anything like that. So when people say, "Oh, Genesis 1, it's poetry," no. Read the Psalms, read Job, read Proverbs, right? Read those, see the couplets and whatnot that are done there, And you'll see that that's not at all how Genesis 1 reads. Genesis 1 reads as a very matter-of-fact event after event after event after event. Now, there are all sorts of interesting stylizations going on in here, right? You've got the first 3 days are basically God creating the rough materials of the world, creating form and some functionality. And then in the second 3 days, there's all this filling up of those things that he made in the first day. So I want to be sensitive as a reader to recognize that there are these beautiful kind of parallelisms that are going on as each of the days, like 1 and 4 and 2 and 5 and 3 and 6, connect in this kind of grid. Some people have looked at it and said, well, that means that it's fictitious. That means that it's just a literary device. Except for this match is not perfect enough. If I was just doing this as a literary device, there's a whole bunch of weird things that don't quite match up, like, you know, animals that are flying across the face of the firmament, or swimming in the seas. For example, in day 5, you get the animals that swim in the seas. Well, sea is not defined until the 3rd day. So if day 5 has to match day 2, it does so imprecisely. And there's a few of those things that just kind of weave back and forth in this overall nice mesh. And I think that points us to the idea that this literary development is something that is layered on top of the text's historical core statements. We have this word day, which in Hebrew is yom, and it's the only word that is available in the Hebrew lexicon to represent an actual 24-hour period of time. If you wanted to talk about long periods of time, such as my old Earth colleagues believe, there's actually other words in Genesis 1 that would be available and better to use if you were trying to communicate long periods of time for things. So think about day 4 and what's made on day 4, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And they are given for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. So you've got seasons and years and times. Those are all words that are available that are far less stringent about their meaning than the Hebrew word yom is. Now, can yom mean more than just a 24-hour period of time? Yeah. In fact, the first time that it's used in Genesis, it's talking about the light part of the day. Right? It's just talking about the daytime. So you've got daytime, you've got a 24-hour day. You have a sense in which day can mean an indeterminate period of time, but that's usually used in a future sense, like the day of the Lord. That's a typically future-looking sort of thing, and it's a little bit different. You also have in the day of, which is a Hebrew construction. It's beh yom, it's of day. And Hebrew scholars have recently, over the past 30 or 40 years, realized that this really means when. So I grew up reading the King James Version, and it would say, there's these 6 days of creation, 7th day of rest. And the next verse, going into Genesis 2, it would say, on the day in, this is the account of the heavens and the earth in the day in which God created them. And you would go like, wait a minute, I thought it took 7 days. And this would be an argument that old Earth creationists might say, hey, look, the word yom is being used to describe an expanse of time. It is, but only beh yom is being used for this. It's of day, and that is more naturally when. So now we see a lot more of our modern translations, the NIV, the ESV, etc. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when God created them. And so looking at the days, the use of the term yom is important. The describing of the day as something that has an evening and a morning is something that we see used consistently in the Old Testament when evenings are talked about and mornings are talked about. They're not just like dawns of an age. They're part of an actual day. When they're used together, it's talked about as an actual day. And then we have those numbers, right? The first day, the second day. In some parts of Genesis 1, those days actually have like the 6th day. But in other parts, like the first day is actually day 1. So it's implied in all cases that the is there. So we naturally translate it as the first day, but it actually says day 1. So there's evening, there's morning, day 1. There's an evening and there's morning, day 2. There's evening and a morning, the 3rd day, right? So it's kind of weird. They kind of jump around, but that's just because in Hebrew, you have a definite article, the, but you don't have an indefinite article, an and because of that, their rules for using the are very different from ours. We have very strict sorts of rules for them. They play all over the place. But those numbers that go along with day, first, second, or 2, 3, everywhere else that we look in scripture, save one prophetic passage. And so we've got like, 2,300 instances of the word yom around, hundreds of them with numbers. And there's only one instance in which it's prophetic and possibly talking about multiple days in a time. Everywhere else, it's the number that's being discussed. Those are actual days. The children of Israel marched around the walls of Jericho 7, not ages, not 7
Days.
millennia. It's days. Otherwise, Joshua's still marching around dodging grape slushies from the wall. So those are some of the reasons why young earth creationists look at this and say the days of creation as outlined in Genesis 1 are regular days. They're following all of the Hebrew lexical rules and grammatical rules for understanding them as day. And to try and interpret them as something else means that you've got to try and move around those rules a little bit. Not to say that maybe you can't, but it brings a challenge to reading the text.
Because I always see too, like the easiest way to understand this is each day is defined by a solar day, and you can see that with evening and night, and each day begins that way, and each day ends that day. And then, as you mentioned, that sequential order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You follow all the way down to 7, and then it's kind of like you said, if we apply maybe spiritual interpretation or whatever you want to call it to like Jericho, like that's a great point. Like he's still probably walking around,
right?
To who knows when book 2 comes home,
waiting for those walls to come down. Now you mentioned the 6 days as solar days, and I can hear some of my old Earth friends and my theistic evolution friends are like, wait a minute, no,
pump the brakes there,
because for the first 3 days we don't have a sun.
Yeah,
so we don't have a solar day. So this has been classically one of the arguments for maybe taking the days as not being literal, because how can you have a day when you have no sun? And yet, when we take a look at the first 3 days and how day is defined, right? There's evening, there's morning, the first day, then there's second and third. Then we get into the next 3 days, and it's said exactly the same. There's no change in how the day is described. So it seems unlikely that there's a difference in the way the day is unfolding. So what that means then is that there is some other form of light besides the sun that God has provided to illuminate the planet. Now, what that is not talked about in the text at all. God simply says, let there be light, and there was light. He separates that so that there is evening and morning, so that as the earth rotates, parts of it experience that day and that night cycle. And as long as there is a fixed point of light out there somewhere, then God has, done what he needed to do for the earth. And at a later point in the week, on day 4, God provides the sun. It says that he made the sun, he made the moon. It actually uses different words for him. It doesn't even use their names, but that's a different, interesting theological situation.
Yeah.
But God makes the sun and gives it the role then of bearing the light that he created on the first day. So this is a theological way of deprioritizing the sun. It's not something that you worship. It hasn't been around since the beginning of creation. It is a created thing, and it's not even on the first day. So it helps to remove from the ancient Israelites a tendency to worship this thing, because they've just come out of Egypt. And like, who do you worship in Egypt? Well, Ra. I mean, the sun god is the most important, most powerful God of them all. And this is just one of several ways in Genesis that God is deprioritizing the heavenly bodies and building in theological arguments about proper worship in the very creation of the world, which happened long before there were even Israelites. I mean, just the foreknowledge of God of what he's going to do so that he can prepare his people later on is astonishing.
Well, and as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking, this totally flies in the face of evolution, because if you have, like you mentioned, the Earth first, then the sun, that's totally backwards from what we're taught. But I kind of want to talk about that too, because it's easy to spot, okay, evolution is wrong, but the problem is, when what I see is that theistic evolution comes along, and then they want to interpret Genesis 1 to fit the evolution model. So can you explain, like, basically, what that is and like why that's wrong?
So my evolutionary, theistic evolutionary brothers and sisters, right? They're Christians who believe in the risen Lord Jesus Christ. So I will affirm their Christianity, even if we disagree about this issue of origins here. There's a lot of different ways that people have attempted to interpret the text of Genesis to make it seem compatible or outside the realm of science. So some people have tried to say, if we read the text in the right way, then it matches up with evolution and it's all okay. Others will say, actually, science and the Bible, they're talking about totally different things. So we should just keep them nice and separate. And if we do that, then we don't run into problems. And that's more of the way that we've seen people try to approach it right now. Perhaps the most influential theistic evolutionary perspective theologically has been advanced by John Walton. And his argument is that Genesis chapter 1 is not a document of history, but is rather a document of temple inauguration. He thinks that it was a sacred text that might have been read every year at a temple ceremony, and that it is describing God creating the world as a temple for himself and establishing a special people who will operate as his priests on earth to represent him on the planet. And his argument is that there is no material creation that is accomplished in Genesis 1. None. The text is not talking about the physical construction of the earth at all. Instead, he thinks that what it is doing is God is assigning functionality to things. So the way that he kind of puts an analogy is kind of like a house or an apartment, someplace that you live, and you arrange all the furniture and you put things in certain places and you call this a bedroom, right? You've got a bed here, you've got some books, you've got, the stuff that you have there. You can have another room, you call this your office because that's the desk, the academic books, your computer. You've got all these rooms inside your house and you have appointed things in there and you have decided what to call the places. And by doing that, you have created your home, right? I made this place my home. This is my house. I made it. Did you? Well, no, right? I didn't throw any of the timbers up behind me or anything like that. I didn't put this as a rented place anyway. I don't even say I owned it, right?
You don't own it. You definitely don't.
That's right. That's right. So Walton is saying that, yes, God did physically create the world. I mean, that much is very obviously clear, but he's saying that Genesis 1 is not talking about that at all. It's simply talking about God basically arranging the furniture, giving things names. And in doing so, this would be the way that the ancient world would have thought about creation, that ancient gods didn't make the world. They organized and gave order to chaos. There are a few things about the way Genesis 1 is structured that I think does point to God, establishing the world as a temple. But I think that's a very minor aspect of what the text is really trying to do. In order to make this argument, Walton has got to try to argue that the Hebrew word for create, which is bara, is not talking about material creation, but assigning functionality. This is a word that is only ever associated with God, and it doesn't always mean material creation. After all, it says in the Psalms, David says, "Create in me, O God, a new heart." And that is bara. So bring about something in me that only you can do, God. You have to make this happen in me. So we do see bara used in non-physical ways. And yet in Genesis 1, physical construction seems to be the only thing anybody ever noticed about this text. And we don't have any ancient witnesses that talk about this as something that is not about physical creation. And the use of other words like make, which is the Hebrew word asah, is used almost interchangeably with bara throughout Genesis 1. We see bara used in the first day, and then it's skipped and it doesn't show up until God is creating the animals on day 5 and day 6. So there's something particularly special about them. But what he does do is he does make things as well. And that Hebrew word asah is really a very physical word. People make things. And so, don't make for yourself any graven image. 10 Commandments, that's asah. Don't make it. Don't build it. It's a thing. And so when God says that he made things in Genesis 1, I think it's really hard to get around God not doing that in a physical sense. And also, the order and function arguments run into a couple of weird problems. For example, if God is saying, let there be light, and there was light, and he called the light day. This is what Walton says was the first clue that he had that maybe Genesis is not talking about physical creation, because day is not a physical thing. Day is like brightness. He doesn't call the light light. He doesn't call it what it is. He calls it by what it does. It makes day. But the sun is created on day 4. It's made. Let the lights appear in the heavens. God made those. So that's a saw there. Well, why didn't the sun gain its function? If he thinks the sun has always been around, giving light to earth over millions and millions of years, then when God created light, why did he wait to call the sun the greater light? Wait, that's really weird, because then it's on day 4 then that the sun is supposed to take hold of its function, but it's already been functioning since day 1. I don't see how that sort of thing works. I don't see how some of these other issues really work. So I think that Walton is doing what many folks on the old Earth and the theistic evolution side have been doing ever since the latest 17 and especially early 1800s. And that is, they're searching for a way to read the text in such a way that it allows us to sidestep the scientific problems that seem to arise from ancient geology, from astronomy, evolutionary biology, etc. They're looking for a way to read the text so that it doesn't come into conflict with these. And so historically, as we look through the 1800s to today, we see the first of these is to argue that maybe there's a giant gap between Genesis 1:1, when God creates, and Genesis 1:2. Maybe that's some sort of judgment, and then God restarts. So gap theory was instituted to preserve a 6-day creation. After the gap, each of those days was supposed to be regular days. But maybe we can fit all of geological history in this judgment zone. So God created, and dinosaurs lived and died, and then God wiped it all clean and started off. He wanted humans around. And that worked for a little while, but really 1802 is when it was first written down and published. And it survived in England until about the 1840s or 50s. And by that time, it was being eclipsed by the day-age view, which originated on continental Europe. People saying that maybe each of the days is just a long period of time. And so that was the beginning of what we now call progressive creationism. It started off as day-age, and it's been tweaked and whatnot. But they can at least point to 200 years worth of theology saying, hey, we've been around for a long time. And these were the very conservative positions that were being held to when higher criticism started coming around in the 1850s and 60s and whatnot. So as biblical inerrancy was challenged and biblical accuracy was challenged, when the fundamentalist response happened, they looked back and found day, age, and gap theory as the previous early arguments that were saying, hey, Moses is the author of Genesis. Hey, the text of Genesis is talking about real events. And so it's unsurprising, in a sense, that the fundamentalists' writings tended to focus on day, age, and gap theory, and why here in America we have this long history of having them. So those views came, and they had their time, and they've kind of been on the decline. Gap theory is pretty much dead. Nobody holds on to that anymore. Day age is really the realm now of only progressive creationists like Hugh Ross. That view is no longer being held in very high esteem. The framework hypothesis idea was that view that Genesis, as a literary construction with those 3 couplets, indicated that the text of Genesis was not historical in any way. And Meredith Kline was one of the powerful proponents of that. Ritterboss, another. And that was something that is held on for quite a while. There's still a few proponents. Dick Averbeck, recently retired at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He kind of holds to that as a literary framework view. And then you have a few others. Jack Collins has recently proposed an analogical view that the work week of God is supposed to be an analogy to the Israelite work week. And so to be a good Israelite, God does a good week of work.
Wow.
But let's not think that God's days in creation are like our days. It's an analogy. So 7 days, God works, he rests, we work, we rest. This is what God does. My challenge on that one, and Jack Collins' writing is very, very powerful. It's really good. I like him as a scholar, and we've known each other a little bit over the years. The one thing that I look at, though, is that the days of creation are not God's days. They are days that are defined according to an experience on earth, right? The light and the dark, the evening and the morning, these are not with God as the referent. These are with the earth
That's a
as
great
the
point.
referent. And so I don't think the analogy view holds up. And so Walton is one of the newer ones here with this analogical position. Sorry, not analogical, but with this temple inauguration approach to it. So, that's kind of where people are right now. Others will say maybe Genesis is, William Lane Craig has recently tried to argue that Genesis is what he calls mytho-history.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, and his use of mytho-history is very different than actually the originator of the term mytho-history.
Yeah.
So there's some problems there. I don't think that Craig's view is going to end up getting wide distribution amongst, certainly not Old Testament scholars. It'll have a pretty good influence probably in your systematic theology folks and your apologists. But from experiences that I've had with evangelical theologians, they're not liking this perspective very much at all. And he's one of the 4 people who are in the multi-authors view on Adam, actually, that I talked about earlier.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Other,
Actually, I know he's kind of getting big into that, Adam historical, historicity talk and
yeah,
everything.
yeah. His view is that we can have a historical Adam. The Bible, he thinks, ultimately necessitates a historical Adam, not from Genesis. He thinks that Genesis doesn't require us to believe in a historical Adam, but that Romans does, and probably Acts 17, the Mars Hill sermon, and possibly 1 Corinthians 15. Those are the only places he think in the Bible that actually really compel us to hold to a historical Adam. Everything else, he says, we can simply look at Adam as a literary character and be fine. But he thinks, no, we've got Adam, and he thinks that Adam could be a historical individual if we put him far back enough in time. And it's pretty far back, 750,000 years ago, 750,000 years back is when he thinks Adam could be the progenitor of all humans. And that's because he thinks that Neanderthal skeletons represent humans. And there, actually, he and I agree. We disagree totally on the time scale, but we actually both agree that Neanderthals represent humans that are descended from Adam. From his perspective, because the Neanderthals lived over here and we are over here, if they're both human, then we've got to trace their ancestry back in time until we get to that point where both of them diverge. And he says that's where we can have Adam.
Wow. Hearing you talk, one of the things I'm thinking of too, maybe just to, hopefully encourage somebody out there is that, you can have confidence in biblical creation, like holding to the Bible. I know it's totally opposite from what the world tells you. And, a lot of people, you probably don't even think about, the alternative to evolution. But, again, like hearing you talk, it just reminds me, you can have confidence in the scriptures. And I think, hearing all these views and even some other views that, like I'm not really too familiar with myself, I'm just thinking, if you just kind of take it back, kind of like, we talked about, like, and just interpret the Bible in the plain sense, in the literal sense, and you go through Genesis, you can just kind of have a firm grasp and assurance, like, this is what God did, this is work. And, and let that be your standard as you compare. And as really your faith is kind of attacked, like, oh no, evolution. Oh no, Adam wasn't real. All these things are just kind of coming at you. You just bring it back and have the confidence in God's word.
Absolutely. I think you're totally on point with that. There are hard parts of the Bible. There are parts of the Bible that are really difficult to understand, and you don't get it. You're reading some of the minor prophets going, I just don't know what you're even talking about. But Genesis 1 through 11 is not like those, right? It's not some weird oracle that is difficult to interpret. You sit down, you read it, and you have a really good picture of what has just happened and how it connects to everything else that's going on. Oh yeah, sure. Okay. I find now we're at this guy, Abram, and what's going to go on. And is he going to be the one that God is, looking for? And it seems like he is. And, so you don't get this, like, people wrestle a lot with Genesis, and I understand that, but I think you're right. We often kind of end up overthinking this text. in our concern that there are externalities that are forcing us into something different, that are forcing us to try to approach the text not on its own terms, but bringing some terms of our own to it, which is always a dangerous thing to do with the Bible. And so, yeah, I think from a scriptural standpoint, not only in Genesis, but as I said, canonically speaking, we are on tremendously firm ground to hold to a young earth
Amen.
creation perspective.
Yep.
It really is the unified perspective of the whole of Scripture. And I would say, even when you see sometimes a perspective like young earth creationism not defended well, or you kind of say, boy, that, I don't know, the other guy did a better job.
Yeah.
I would say that actually, there's way more to the story in this. And that's one of the things that I've had such a tremendous benefit from, having a sister as an Old Testament scholar and her dragging me to meetings of the Evangelical Theological Society. Like, I'm a fossil guy. I'm a rocks guy. I'm a science guy. And she's like, no, they need to talk to you and you need to listen to what they're doing. Here's another book and read this person. And I need you to talk to so-and-so. And it's like, okay, so now I'm going to theology meetings as often or more than I'm going to like my science meetings. And it's like, wait, what kind of world have I jumped into here? This is really interesting and neat. And a whole different side to the arguments about creation and evolution than what I was accustomed to, kind of living in my own little bubble of young earth, young earth, old earth folks, or what have you.
Yeah, definitely. And your theology comes into play with this because I remember watching you at Liberty University talking about like fossil bones and everything, and you gave some external evidence, but before I kind of ask you like what are the external evidence, I'm just thinking your theology does come into play with this, which is a great thing because it's like God's the creator, so there's going to be evidence in confirmation to this. So are there any like kind of like like real simple like nutshell like external like what is the external evidence for young earth creation? Because I know you specialize in I'm sorry, you said paleontology.
Yeah.
So does that go
Yeah.
into like bones and everything of fossil records?
It does.
Nice.
It's dinosaurs and woolly mammoths and far more than you could possibly
And you're
imagine.
still a young earth creation and not an evolutionist. So that says something.
Right. Yeah. And as I said, I went through my entire educational experience in the public schools, and my experience going through geology programs and paleontology programs were difficult at times. At times, very, very difficult. At other times, all right. I learned some important lessons. Number one, as an undergraduate, nobody cares what you do or what you say or what you think because you're just an undergraduate student. So I was, president of a creation club on campus at Penn State, and some of my geology professors knew that, and it bothered them. It annoyed them in some way. And maybe I annoyed them. I wasn't always as arrogant sometimes,
Yeah.
as you are when you're young and you think you know a lot of stuff. But they never came after me. They never sought to like boot me out of the program or anything like that. They graded me fairly in my classes. What I discovered was that when you try to become a graduate student, the rules of decorum kind of change. When I went to South Dakota, the School of Mines there was a big dust up in Kansas while I was there. Kansas State School Board said, hey, we don't want evolution or Big Bang on the final state tests. You can teach it, but we're not testing this stuff, which meant most people wouldn't teach it, right? And that was a big dust up, and that happened in 1999 while I was in my grad program. And I'd also written a little bit about young earth creation, or really about intelligent design stuff at that time, which was kind of the big deal of the late 90s and early 2000s. And my whole world crumbled around me. Professors played fast and loose with grading and gave me bad, worse marks than other people for stuff. They tried to throw me out of the program and flunk me out. They couldn't. My grades were bad for a while, but they weren't bad enough to kick me out. And so I hung around, and they all abandoned me for projects. So I had no thesis to work on, or it was awful. It took me 4.5 years to graduate with a master's degree in paleontology, and the whole program nearly collapsed while I was there too. I was all kinds of realms of unhealthy. And I had my own particular, Dante's level of hell going on. And South Dakota is cold. I mean, that's like level 8 and 9 down if you know your Inferno. It's rough.
So Ice Age levels.
Yeah, it is. Crystals over their eyes as they cry. It's all. I loved that. Oh, that was such a neat book to read. So yeah, I was being actively persecuted for being a young Earth creationist, even when I didn't bring it into class. Like I wasn't writing my class assignments or my thesis like this or anything like that. I then moved out to Rhode Island, and I was also there, known as a young Earth creationist. I never withheld that from my professors, because in an area that was as touchy as creation evolution is, and as close as it is to something like paleontology. I mean, you've got the age of the Earth argument, you've got biological evolution arguments. They're all wrapped up together in here. Um, I thought that it was in my advisor's best interest to know what I thought. That even if I wasn't going to be bringing it into the classroom or projects or thesis or anything, they deserve to know. If I was in chemical engineering or something like that, who cares?
Yeah, right.
What does it matter? If I'm doing something like that. But for them, I thought that it was important that they knew. And some of them reacted well, and some of them reacted poorly. My PhD advisor was a godsend. It was a wonderful guy. And my PhD advisor, David Fostovsky, is an agnostic, secular Jewish evolutionist, right?
Mouthful.
And here am I, right? I am a theistic Gentile young Earth creationist, right? And so like our perspectives couldn't be any further apart. But Fostovsky is a philosophically very astute scientist, and he knew that the root cause of our difference was that when we asked the question, does God exist? He said, I don't think so. I know enough to know that I can't say no, but I doubt it. And I said yes. And that is the beginning point for where our differences start. And it's not that I necessarily have to be a young Earth creationist, or that sort of thing. But he recognized that the pathway philosophically and theologically that I've taken drives me towards certain types of things that I can allow or not allow in my understanding of the world, just as his own choices create a set of decisions, some of which that he's got flexibility on, others that he kind of doesn't.
Yeah.
And because he was comfortable with himself and he didn't feel threatened by my existence as a young Earth creationist, he was a fantastic advisor, and we worked well together. And along the way, I learned that there were a lot of challenges to young Earth creationism, and there was also some good evidences for them. So, thinking about that issue, there's lots of challenges like radioactive dating methods. What about uranium dating and carbon dating and a bunch of others that seem to indicate that the Earth is tremendously ancient? Those are hard questions for a young Earth creationist to answer. And if a young Earth creationist tells someone, if you're out in the audience, you're listening, a young Earth creationist says, young Earth creationist has a total answer for that. I'm a geologist. No, we don't have a total answer for that. We do have some answers, some really interesting answers that I think point towards a young Earth, but we don't have the whole thing sewed up. So we want to be careful about how we present that. So let me give you an example of that. So uranium is an element on the periodic table that we've heard about because it's dangerous, right? It's radioactive, which means that every once in a while it spits out little parts of itself and sends out waves of energy that can be very dangerous to us. Now, uranium by itself, you could hold it in your hand and it would feel a little warm because it's throwing little particles basically about the size of a helium atom, and those would impact your hand and it would warm up your hand. So really, if you're holding onto uranium, a uranium ore, the only protection you really need is like a piece of paper. Like I put it there, that's fine. But the byproducts of uranium later on, those ones get really nasty. So you have to take some care and some caution with those. So as uranium decays, eventually it becomes lead. And when it becomes lead, it's finally stable. It's not going to decay anymore. But it gets rid of about 8 helium atoms along the way. So it just keeps spitting these things out, changing its identity. It goes from uranium to another element called thorium. Then it backs up to uranium through a weird process. Then it goes to thorium, and then it starts going down and down. And it keeps spitting things out. Sometimes it's spitting out the helium. Sometimes it's spitting out these other things like electrons. And sometimes and as it does that, it gives off radiation like gamma rays and X-rays, really nasty stuff that can do bad things to your body. So in a crystal of a rock, let's see, I got some rocks hanging around here in my office.
It's perfect.
I'm a geologist.
There we go.
Trying to see if I've got actually the right sort of rock around me. I don't, but hey, this is work. So here we've got a specimen, and I'll try and hold this up and this camera, folks. There we go. There's a nice.
Yeah, there we go. We see it. Perfect.
Cool. That is a mineral called Amazonite. It's a
Huh.
cool bluish feldspar. And let's see, as I hold it here, it's a little thing, which finger? Here we go. Right by that finger. Let's see, get this to focus. There we go.
There we go.
So right by the finger here
Yeah.
is a little grain of a mineral called mica. It's a flat, flaky mineral. And the dark ones are called biotite mica. And in those biotite mica flakes are sometimes other little tiny minerals sandwiched in between their layers. And there's uranium in those little minerals. They're called zircons. And so the uranium is trapped inside the zircon, and it's radioactively decaying, right? It's becoming other things. It's eventually becoming lead. It spits out these helium atoms, and the helium atoms escape through the zircon because helium doesn't bind with anything. It just keeps wiggling its way out until it's free. And so as the uranium decays to lead, we can, what most scientists do is they'll look at the ratio of uranium to lead, and knowing how fast uranium decays to lead in the present world, they'll then calculate the age back, right? So if you know that, a train is leaving Chicago, it's going 50 miles an hour, how long will it take to get to New York? Well, that's just a question of what's the distance and what's the velocity. I won't ask anyone to calculate that. This isn't that kind of show, right? And along the way, it ejects these helium atoms, 8 of them. Okay, so using that method, this rock, or a creation scientist studied a rock that would give an age of a little over 1.5 billion years. That's a lot older than young Earth creationism says the world is. So we have a rock that says, I'm 1.5 billion years worth of radioactive decay old. Okay. Well, what about all that helium that's leaking out of the crystal that's leaving? Well, the scientists thought, well, if we know how big the crystal is, and we know how much helium was made, because we know how much lead is in it, and you just take the number of lead times 8, that's how much helium was made. Well, if we know how fast the helium can get out of the crystal, then we can also date the crystal by how much helium is still in it. If the helium escapes at a certain rate, then, okay, in a 1.5 billion years, how much helium should still be in that crystal? Or in a few thousands of years, how much helium would be in that crystal? Those would be 2 very different answers. Very, very different answers. If the crystal has only been around for 6,000 years and all that radioactive decay happened really fast, then the helium piled up and is still trying to vent. If the crystal has been around for 1.5 billion years and the helium is being made every once in a while, there's almost no helium in there because it's able to escape about as fast as it's being made. Whereas if you make all of it at once, it's going to take a while for the stuff to escape. So a group of scientists made some predictions. 2 years later, they got a sample from a location in Wyoming, and they had another lab take a look at it. It wasn't a young Earth creation lab. They had another lab do the analysis and determine how much helium was in it. And it came up in the 6,000 year range, not the 1.5 billion year range.
Man.
And like what was amazing, right? The prediction graph was published 2 years before the sample was collected. This is what we would expect. From other minerals, we know this is supposed to date 1.5 billion.
Well, that's true science. They're making a prediction.
That's exactly right, right? This is you're making a hypothesis and a prediction. You go out, you collect your data, you have it analyzed, you get back your results, and you report and interpret. That's science.
That's
right
science, yeah.
It's that's what we try and tell kids in science fair. Like, this is one way to do science fair. There are actually, I don't like the word scientific method because there isn't a scientific method. There are all kinds of scientific methods because there's different ways of doing science. As a paleontologist, I might not have a hypothesis about a fossil that I just uncovered because my scientific work right now is about describing what it is. Scientific description is part of science. So not all of science is always about testing hypotheses and predictions, but that's a big part of it. So here they got their stuff, and they finally got different results than anybody expected, except for them, right? They're like, hey, if it's here, it should be this, and if it's really this, it should be here. Bingo! I mean, nailed it. It was amazing to look at the predictive book and then the results book, and so you go, all right. this crystal is giving me 2 ages. It's giving me an age of 1.5 billion years if I look at the uranium and the lead, and it's giving me an age of like 6 to 10,000 years if I'm looking at the helium. So which is it, right? It's
Yeah.
either one or the other or neither. Maybe everything's wrong. That's a possibility, right? So I think that what this shows is that there was an acceleration of that radioactive decay, that radioactive decay happened very, very quickly, probably part of creation week activity. As God is creating the world, he is building a world. He allows radioactive decay to move very, very quickly. And it built up stuff so fast that after this stuff cooled and became the crust that God wanted it to be, it hasn't had time to vent out all of its helium. So this is giving us a possible indicator from the helium week dates that the amount of radioactive decay was greatly accelerated during creation week, which is a miraculous period of time, right? Somebody's going to say, well, how did God do it? Well, I don't know. I'm not a theoretical physicist. There was a guy who wrote in that book, and I don't understand his chapter, right? I don't get that.
Yeah.
And he outlines several options and possibilities of what might physically have happened. But one of the things that I also have to remind myself about in this, and young earth creationists can sometimes, I think, fall into this trap, is that we want to have a materialist explanation for everything, even if it's a lot faster. It's like what nature does, just really sped up. But remember, creation week is a miraculous period of time. God operates on the miraculous plane whenever he so chooses. The flood is an event that has physical consequences, and we should be able to study that by looking at geology and fossils and things like that. But it also is something that has probably got a miraculous component because it happened when God wanted it to. And we get the impression that it would not have happened if God didn't want it to happen, right? God willed this thing to happen, told Noah probably 100+ years ahead of time, this is what's going to happen. So the flood, no doubt, has certain miraculous components to it. And I think that for us as creationists, and for me as a scientist, that's a hard thing for me to say, right? Because the core of science has always been kind of natural explanations only, please. Because I don't expect God to be in the beaker that I'm looking at, stirring things up in a way that I can't predict.
Yeah.
And that's because God also providentially upholds his creation. Right? He doesn't need to muck with my beaker. That doesn't bring him any glory. He is upholding the entire universe right now by his very breath. Every moment is miraculous, some of which we can see very directly. Others we are just in the flow of all the time. And I think that kind of naturalistic perspective to science works a lot, works very well in our day-to-day experience, right? Until God does something miraculous and everybody's like, I don't know how that happened. Like, well, obviously.
Yeah, right.
We don't operate on that plane.
Yeah.
But it also reminds me that as I think about the past, I cannot rule out the miraculous. If I do, I am not looking at the world through God's eyes. And if I don't look at the world through God's eyes, then I'm going to have a skewed view of what it is. If I don't look at the world and understand that it is fundamentally broken in certain ways, even though it's very good and yet crippled somehow by sin, right? That permeates the universe in ways that we all feel and sense and recognize. Every time bad things happen, we wonder why. Why did that have to happen to me? Why did that have to happen to them? Why does it have to happen at all? And part of the answer is because of sin that introduced a broken world. That's not the complete answer. Don't get me wrong. My wife and I, we miscarried our first child. It was devastating to us.
Yeah.
It had been very difficult for us to conceive. And then when we did, we told everybody about it. And when we went to the first ultrasound at week 8, there was nobody there.
Oh man, that's tough.
That was a hard year.
Yeah.
We watched a lot of movies just because we didn't have the energy to do anything else, right?
Yeah, I mean, you lost a child,
Yeah, and we didn't get to know that child at all.
Yeah.
And we didn't even know about it for very long. But we were so excited, and we lost that child. And in one sense, I can point back and say, yeah, thanks, Adam. But that doesn't, that's not a big help. But if we recognize that because of Adam's sin and because of our continuing sin, we live in a world that is fundamentally broken and will remain broken until Jesus mends it back again. But the very fact that we recognize that the world is broken, that we don't like what happens here, that we look at it and say, God, why? Or other people say, there can't be a God because, well, you have just imported an understanding of morality onto a world that if God doesn't exist, that morality can't exist either. If God doesn't exist, you don't get to ask the question why. You don't get to say that there is evil in the world
You need
because,
him to ask that question.
right, yeah, the
Yeah,
question is nonsensical. If there is no God, there is
yeah.
no evil because there is no metric to recognize good versus evil. There simply are events. And some of those events are pleasant to me. Some of those events are unpleasant. Other ones don't bother me one way or the other. I don't care.
Mhm.
But nothing's bad. It's only bad for me. And that is not a standard to which you can hold God. God doesn't get held to a standard of bad for me or good for me. But if you recognize that the very fact of me saying this thing is wrong and shouldn't happen is an argument for God's existence that all of
Mm.
us share and all of us have together.
And even science too, it's like, you mentioned like, it's okay, we don't know everything and that's okay, but God is what gives us the faith that science exists because this is his world and he's put things in motion that justify reason and rationality and logic and deduction. So, take away God, like there is no science.
Yeah.
And that's the whole
Or
spiel of why we want to know. I want to know God's creation more, and knowing that I can because this is what God did, and He put things in order where there's going to be similarities, and I can assume tomorrow is going to be like today, and so many other things.
yeah, the very fact that our experience and the rules of science and other
Yeah.
things too, right? All of us, if I take this, you're just going to test gravity. Sure enough, gravity works, and I'm going to expect that to happen each and every time
Mhm.
because the world is orderly. The universe operates on rules that are predictable, and it's no surprise looking back at history that science was birthed out of Christian Europe because they recognized, different from the pagans, that the world was created by a single deity, triune deity, but a single deity who himself is, created with order, created with rationality and intentionality and understandability, and created us in his image so that we would be able to manage the creation that he has made. If creation operated on random rules, because there are multiple gods that are always at odds with one another. I mean, every pagan religion is like this. Um, every polytheistic religion is like this. All the gods are basically grown-up versions of us. They're just bigger and they have, more powerful toys like lightning bolts and tsunamis.
Mhm.
And as a result, they hate each other. They have alliances. They mess around and do things. They don't know what's going on half the time because they're not even the gods that created this world, right? They overthrew their parents who overthrew the creator cosmos god. I mean, think about what happened in Greek mythology. It's
Yeah.
the same thing that happened in
Free
Mesopotamian
for all.
gods. It's a scrum, it's a mess. But God, the great I am, I mean, just the very name is a statement of permanence. And when I would talk to my students and talk about, God's attributes, and that one of them is that he's consistent with himself. And God doesn't lie. Well, why not? Well, because to lie is to be inconsistent with oneself. That very name, I am, implies and is later expanded in scripture as, right, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Mhm.
Why? Because I am is a statement of existence, of mere reality. And that doesn't change if God is the great I am, if he is Yahweh, the creator God. And so science makes sense in a Christian perspective. And I would submit that my many colleagues who are not Christians, my many friends over the years that I spent time I was roommates with, office mates. We wrote papers together. We went to classes together. They were my advisors, my friends. Those who aren't Christians are folks who I think don't realize that they're piggybacking on Christian theology in order to do science.
Oh yeah. 100%.
Theology makes sense of the world in ways that atheism and polytheism simply can't.
Amen. What do it's a perfect time to ask, why does this matter then? Like, why does young Earth creation matter today? as
Well,
Christians?
yeah, that's a really good question, because we're often told this is a divisive issue. It's something that separates Christians. It keeps us
Yeah.
from being in harmony with one another, and it is. It's one of those things that we argue about, right? It's an in-house debate that we have, and sometimes it's external, right? You may have a young Earth creationist versus an atheistic evolutionist, for example. So why does this matter to us? Well, on the one hand, I'll be upfront and say, right, it's not a salvation issue.
Mhm.
Right? One can come to Jesus Christ and recognize that he was born of the Virgin Mary, lived a sinless life, died on the cross, rose on the third day, and ascended to the Father in glory and power. If you can say that, you are my brother and sister in Christ. Amen and amen. And I want as many people to say that as absolutely possible. When Paul or Peter are preaching, they preach Christ crucified and raised. So
Amen. Yeah.
let's get that straight, right?
Yeah.
That is that is ultimate. So why does this issue matter? Well, I think this issue matters ultimately because it makes sense of why Jesus comes to die on the cross for our sins. How do we know what sins are unless we have an understanding of what sin of where it comes from? We recognize that we do wrong things. And if we recognize that wrong is a word that we can use because it's grounded in reality, there's a God out there, he's got some standards for us, and we don't measure up to these things. Why? Did he make us substandard? Did he make us something that was prone to sin? I don't think so. I don't think that a God who loves us so much that he would send Jesus Christ to live and be one of us and then to die in our place and rise from the grave to show his power over death. I don't think that a God who's willing to do that built us sinners in the first place. And that's where I have a big issue with, especially my theistic evolutionary friends, is that their view of Adam's existence, either he did exist or he didn't, humanity's existence arising out of even providentially overseen evolution, means that God has built into us behaviors and activities that we inherited from our evolutionary ancestors that at some point God decides are evil. They were good before, and then something happens and those same behaviors are bad. So let me give you an example. Chimpanzees are not our direct ancestors. They're supposed to be, they branch off and go this way. We go this way. We had a common ancestor between the two of us. But nonetheless, that common ancestor would have looked something like an apish creature. That apish creature went off in different directions. Chimpanzees are known to war with other clans at times. They will go out and they will fight with other clans in coordinated fashions, and they will kill. They will kill members of their own. If something goes really bad and somebody does something that the rest of the clan doesn't like, they will go and they will murder that other chimpanzee from their own tribe. And it's horrible because, this chimpanzee is going to be beaten to death, right? There's no guns, there's no knives, there's no nothing. It's just, you are going to be bludgeoned and bitten until you are dead. Our ancestors, in an evolutionary perspective of things, did those same things. We have evidence in the anthropological realm of interpersonal violence and murder amongst our own species and other species like Neanderthals, Homo antecessor, et cetera. Cannibalism. I mean, it's gruesome back there. If God eventually decided that sooner or later he wanted to have a particular relationship with some of us as humans, as Homo sapiens, for example, and we have inherited this violent behavior, which is useful to us. It really is. From an evolutionary standpoint, murdering individuals, raping individuals to spread your own genes around is a useful category of behavior. I don't like it. I think
from an
it's
evolutionary
sin.
point, yeah.
But yeah, from an evolutionary standpoint, it is neither good nor bad.
Mhm.
It simply is. It's a behavior, and
Yep.
behavioral scientists are very careful not to assign good or bad to things. Which is, I think, a problem in the way that we do this. But murder has its advantages. Rape has its advantages. Deep parental care has its advantages, and abandonment has its advantages. These are all the sorts of things that our species is given through a process of evolution that God is overseeing, if we're following this logic. And then at some point, God says, you know what? Those are bad. and I'm going to hold you morally accountable, and you will go to hell unless you come to me. But the problem is God built us this way. He made us inferior to the standard of perfection that he puts on us after the fact. We are completely incapable of this. If on the other, and so that's where I look at this and say, this is a serious problem theologically for you. Did God create evil and then decide that we would be held accountable for it? That's not the picture that we have of God in the Bible at all.
Yeah.
Instead, we have a picture of God who is a loving and just and merciful God who will judge, but he judges righteously. And so our understanding of sin that the Bible seems to lay out is that God created a world that did not have sin in it. Sin was introduced. Temptation was brought by Satan. That's something else going on over there, but that's not part of our world until Adam and Eve follow that temptation and they decide to do what the serpent suggests. If they then bring evil into the world, then we have an understanding that we have a good God and we have fallen people and we have consequences for this, rather than apparently a good God who's okay with calling evil very good and then decides to hold us accountable for the evil that was good that's not good anymore. And then he's going to bring Jesus in to solve the problem of evil that we have because he made it for us. Your theology really gets scrambled here. And so that's why I think that this issue of young earth creationism is something that is important. And also, just from a science standpoint, I want to know, what is the real history of the world? I mean, paleontology is a historical science. We look in the past. I mean, we look at things right now, but we're looking at things in the present to understand what happened back then sometime. And I want to know. I'm curious, what really happened? What are the animals that were around? What were the plants that were around? What happened? How did this particular dinosaur come to be here in these rocks with these other things? So, the answers to those questions, if young earth creationism is right, I'm going to have more interesting answers and I'm going to have more accurate answers. So as a scientist, that's my part of my motivation. But on the theological side, my motivation is consistency. I want to have a coherent and consistent understanding of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think only young earth creationism really gives us that.
And that goes into the gospel, and I think about John 1:1, it starts with in the beginning, just like Genesis 1:1.
Yeah.
And, we talk about the first Adam that goes into the second Adam. The first Adam brought sin, second Adam brought life. And you take away the first Adam, you don't have the second Adam. Like it's all connected, even in Paul's theology. Like Paul talked a lot about creation. And
he does.
And Jesus
Absolutely,
talked about, how God created them in the beginning. So it's not just like, oh, it doesn't really matter. It does matter. It goes into it, even to the gospel. Not that you can, as you mentioned, you can still be a Christian and, hold to a different form, but it is connected. Like it's Genesis to Revelation.
Yeah. And let me also say, I would rather someone be a Christian and hold to a different view on creation than not be a Christian, right? No, I want people to believe in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Yes,
Amen.
absolutely. Because he is the way and the truth and the life.
Yes.
And you bring up, Paul. Yeah, Paul's theology, looking at Romans, right, which of course has the biggest outline of Paul's argument for the gospel, because he never got, he wasn't at the church when he wrote it. He was writing to them, trying to get them to understand. So we get a good glimpse at what, sermons from Paul to a mixed group of Gentile and Jewish believers would look like. And I mean, it starts with creation.
Yeah.
And how creation is broken in certain sorts of ways. And it testifies to God, and yet we ignore it. We ignore it all, right? And then there's sin, and sin's everywhere. And it's in the Gentiles. It's even in the Jews. And so what do we need to do? We need to look to someone like Abram, who's not a Jew because he's the father of the Jews. And he can give us the example of what faith looks like, because it's faith before there is the law. Mm-hmm. And then we get to Adam, and he shows us why we all need salvation. It's because we all come from Adam, and that unites the Jews and the Gentiles together. If we all come back to Adam, then Jesus, as the last Adam, makes sense, and he can cover all of our sins, not just Jewish sins, everybody's. And so that's why when he goes to, Athens in Acts 17, and he's there, he's all by himself, and he gets invited to speak. Basically, it's like an invited college lecture over at the Areopagus, and he presents, and he doesn't use Adam's name because nobody knows Adam. I mean, these Greek philosophers and they're not reading Jewish stuff. So he doesn't use Adam's name, but from one man, God made every nation of men and appointed the times and the places where they would live. And he goes on. It's like, yeah, this is Paul's theology. It starts with Adam, because it's only in Adam that Jesus, is able to work salvation. And, that's another sort of thing that we have to, I think I worry about with some of the theistic evolution perspectives, and even a few of the old earth views that are melding in with theistic evolution right now, is that, it becomes very difficult to argue that we actually all are in Adam, if Adam's even a real person. Some theistic evolutionists say, no, he's just a mythology. Now you have to take Paul's theology and say we have to understand Adam as myth, but Jesus is real. And again, your levels of inconsistency start to get really, really high on something like that. And, my wife likes to say, I'd rather have the problems in science that young earth creationism has than the theological problems that some of the other views have, even though they might have, a little bit better handle on the sciences, or a little bit easier way of dealing with the sciences.
And I don't know if my audience caught it, but what Dr. Ross did was he walked through Romans 1-5. And what I also noticed is you use the same hermeneutic, the same method of interpretation from Genesis 1 to Romans 1-5. And there's that consistency with the scriptures, and it's and that's what you said. It's consistent with the Bible. Can Dr. Ross, is there a website that people can find you or follow you on, or any resources?
I'm a Gen X guy who has not gotten, myself a big YouTube channel or anything like that. Like, I've got a YouTube channel, but don't subscribe to it, because I don't post anything there. I really don't. You'll see a few, like, here's the anatomy stickers that we made for Cornerstone, and aren't they cool? Like, it's awful. So I need to do better at that. You can like me on Facebook or what have you. You can follow me and Cornerstone Educational Supply, which is our company. Okay. Again, we make science educational materials for private schools, for homeschools, colleges, and universities. Really, anybody at all.
Put that in the link.
Sure. Great. Thanks very much. I'll provide that for you. And, you'll be able to find me every once in a while. If I'm doing a debate and, you've followed my Facebook or whatever, you'll see that up there. Some things coming up that I think are really cool. I'll be going, here's some places where you can go, right? Nice. If you want to see me, don't worry about me. But where can you go for some good stuff? Go over to Core Academy of Science. They are at coresci.org, coresci.org. That is Core Academy of Science is run by Todd Wood, great friend of mine. Dr. Todd Wood is a biochemist and a creationist who thinks really, really well. Does a lot of research. So if you like the research end of creationism, he's a deep thinker, he's a good thinker, and he's busy. He does a lot of stuff, busier than me. He also has a great YouTube channel with Paul Garner called Let's Talk Creation. And they just passed 50 episodes or so. They've been on for 2 years now. They do an episode every other week. And Let's Talk Creation is phenomenal. And their channel is growing nicely. They're up at 1,600 people right now, and nice. Building. They just passed 1,000 2 months ago. So it's starting to snowball for them, which is great. And what do you do about dinosaurs? Good long talks with radiometric dating. What about astronomy? Questions in the Bible. They do all sorts of stuff. So you got Paul Garner. He's a geologist in the UK. He heads up an organization called Biblical Creation Trust. So that's another great organization. Of course, you've got your big name creation organizations. People know those, but I would say, take a look at some of these smaller ones. 2 other places that I'll point you to. One is called the New Creation blog, newcreation.blog. And that is a fun site. Every, week or so, they got something new up there, and it's a bunch of young folks. These are college students and recent graduates, and they're looking around and reading creation papers and writing summaries for us, or having an interview with somebody or things like that. You're going to get some archaeology on there, which is really cool. You're going to get paleontology and geology and biology, and it's young, it's fresh, it's fun. It's one of those, like, looking at where's the future of young earth creationism going, this is a cool place. Good. And related to that is Genesis History. This was a movie that came out in 2017. I was privileged to be part of it. And so if you can watch the whole movie
That's right.
online.
I think I saw. You know what? I think I saw you on that and watched that.
Yeah, so that came out in theaters back in 2017,
Mm,
and during COVID, when everybody got locked up, for a while, the director was like, you know what? Let's just put this movie on YouTube and just let it go. And
nice.
so now you can watch it, and they've got some extra footage. And but is Genesis history? They're coming out with a new movie in like 2 weeks. The one of the launch parties is coming up next week at Cedarville University. Another one 2 weeks later, or a week later in Tennessee, and it features the work of Dr. Andrew Snelling from Answers in Genesis and Dr. John Whitmore, who's a professor at Cedarville University, and their research on geology in the Grand Canyon. So if the first movie is Genesis history, is kind of like a vision of what young Earth creationism is and kind of the parameters for it, this second film is Genesis History 2, is about showing you what research looks like, real solid bench and outdoor research looks like in a young Earth creation perspective. And so I think that's really great. Something we were talking about before with, like the
Yeah.
radioactive dating. Here's where you see some field research for geology going on in the Grand Canyon, which is always a fun place to watch things happen.
Awesome. Well, yeah, a lot of great resources. And thank you for watching, everybody. If you like this, please help Meth Ministry subscribe, like, and share, and comment, and show your support for Dr. Ross. And Dr. Ross, thank you so much for being here, and spending your time with us.
Oh, really appreciate it, Lucas. Thanks so much for having me on. This was great.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right, guys, take care.